Welcome to another episode of the Tom Trimmer Podcast. Happy Monday, everyone. I hope everyone had a great weekend. Well, last week in fantasy football, I lost a close contest, so we're 0-1 to start the season, but we're hoping to bounce back this week, hoping this weekend brings a little bit more joy on the fantasy football front. It's a little too early to tell whether or not my draft picks will pan out and how my team's going to do. We'll see where that goes as the season moves along. I probably will have a lot more commentary and or complaining about my fantasy football team. So we'll see. Like I said, it's early. Thanks for listening in again this week. And as always, a big welcome to any new listeners joining in for the first time. Your listening and following the podcast is certainly appreciated. And if you enjoy the podcast, please spread the word on social media or with your friends and colleagues. Today, my guest is Rachel Carrillo Fairchild. Rachel is an author, a speaker, and an expert on multilingual learners, or ELs as we often refer to. So that's what we dig into. And get ready to take notes because it is an awesome conversation. Rachel's expertise will be quite evident to you as the conversation unfolds. In Assessment Corner this week, I'm going to talk about levels and a question that seems to keep resurfacing in workshops I'm conducting, and that is the question of why we can't or shouldn't have PointFives on our scales. So that's today's plan. Let's get to it. Rachel Carrillo Fairchild is coming up, but first, don't at me. But I want to open this week with something a little personal. And more to the point, a personal habit that has contributed not only to my personal growth, but to my professional success as well. Now, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the expression past is prologue, which of course originated as a line from Shakespeare's The Tempest. It's basically an expression that submits that everything that has happened in the past sets the context for the present. A prologue, of course, is primarily an introduction that provides a bit of foreshadowing. So in the expression, the past is prologue, the idea is that what has happened in the past foreshadows what is about to occur. Now, as a play on that expression, as much as the past might be prologue, I believe the present is epilogue. I know that's not as artful as Shakespeare, and I didn't expect it to be. But here's what I mean. First, let's begin with the idea of an epilogue. Opposite of the prologue, an epilogue is at the end, and rather than foreshadowing, it offers a conclusion as to what happened, past tense. So in my not-so-artful expression of present as epilogue, my habit is to bring the end to the present, and do this through daily journaling that has become habitual. I write as if the future has already happened. Now let me tell you why I started this and how it has manifested into a habitual practice for me. 12 years ago was when I first started seriously contemplating resigning from my school district job to embark on this career as a speaker, an author, and a consultant. So this is 2 years before I actually did it. And of course, contemplating such a massive change comes with a lot of stress and 360 degrees of thoughts and possibilities. Now, at the time, my kids were 12 and 9, so this was a big decision because, a lot of responsibility with my family and all the potential ramifications that come with it. And like any human being, I was susceptible to giving a disproportionate amount of my attention to the worst case scenarios. So I was, in essence, fear-mongering myself into inaction. So as an athlete in my younger days, and certainly as a coach as an adult, I'd always known about visualization, but what I had come to know more definitively around 2008, 2009 was that visualization was not just about seeing pictures and rehearsing my performance. What I'd come to realize through my own personal learning and growth is that the pictures were a conduit to my emotions. The point of visualization is to generate images that positively impact your emotions and your energy. So as I was contemplating this career shift and at times overwhelming myself with worry, concern, and worst case scenario, I decided I needed to take some control over what I was feeling, and I knew that to impact how I was feeling, I had to change what I was thinking. So I drew upon my days as an athlete and a coach and began to visualize my success. In order to prevent myself from getting distracted and to build this habit, I began to write down my visualizations as if they had already occurred. Now, In the very early stages, this was the last thing I would do before going to sleep at night. I thought, well, if I could plant this positive thought and this positive energy, if that could be the last thing in my mind before falling asleep, then my mind will hopefully fixate on that while I sleep overnight. Now, I'm an early riser, so I'm pretty tired at night. So what ended up happening was I'd skip a few days because I was pretty tired and I'd go to sleep, and days became weeks and weeks became a month or two. And finally I thought, okay, this isn't working for me. I need to find a time that works and will become habitual. So that's when I shifted to the mornings. So what I started doing then was writing some kind of positive affirmation or some sort of statement about what I was hoping to have happen as if it had already happened. So I previewed the future by writing in past tense. I wrote as if what I wanted had already occurred. And listen, I'm not talking about a PhD dissertation here, right? I'm talking about 6 to 8 sentences. It's nothing major. But what I immediately noticed in myself was a shift in my energy and my emotions. I started with the sole purpose of shifting my energy about my potential career change, the one that I was contemplating. So I started writing with prompts like, I'm so happy and grateful now that my book is a bestseller, or I'm so excited that my workshop is sold out and there are others trying to get in and on the waiting list. And, I'd write 6 to 8 sentences that kind of previewed a lot of that. And to be clear, none of that had even occurred at all. At the time I was writing this, I was at least a year or two away from my first book being published. I just wrote as if what I wanted to have happen had already happened. And then, you do this every day and this becomes a habit. So I started to expand the reach by, on occasion, previewing the day ahead in past tense. So maybe I had a big parent meeting coming up. So I'd write something like, the parent meeting today went better than expected. It was a respectful meeting where the parent and I had a chance to express our positions and we found common ground and mutual understanding, something like that. I would sort of preview what the day's events were going to be. Did things always turn out exactly as I wrote? Of course not. Do I know for sure that any of the success I've had over the years has been attributed to this habit? Well, I'd like to think so. But I also know there are a lot of people who are more successful than me who likely never developed this habit, so who's to say? The point for me was as much about the present moment as it was about the manifestation of the future. The point was to purposefully influence my thoughts, which of course influence my emotions, which of course shift my energy in the present moment, right? Our energy comes from our emotions. Our emotions are a product of what we predominantly think about. So now, 12 years later, this has become a daily ritual for me that I really can't ever see myself letting go of. Now, I can only speak for myself, but what it does for me, right off the bat, first thing in the morning, is recalibrate my energy and set me up for what I think is going to be a productive day or a productive event or something that's going to occur that day. Look, it's not like I don't have negative thoughts, negative worries, insecurities, and all of those things. We all do. That's called being a human being. I think this is one of the most misunderstood parts about the whole idea or the prospect of positive thinking. It's not about ignoring reality. It's not about not acknowledging the real challenges that we all face in life. I can't definitively say that any kind of present as epilogue exercise works. What I do know is that if I want to change my situation or circumstances, what works for me is aligning my thoughts with the desirable outcome. Does positive thinking work? I don't know. Does negative thinking work? Well, I think it does, but I can't say for sure. However, here's what I think I know. Only one of those is aligned with what I want to happen. So I do my best to align myself with that positive thinking and that energy. So for me, it's more about the moment. It's more about the habit of starting my day in the right frame of mind, starting my day as if my day has already occurred. Some of you may already do this. And some of you may think I've lost my mind. I'm okay with either. But don't knock it till you try it. Even if you don't write it down, maybe you just sit for 60 seconds and visualize some of the key moments you anticipate that day. Maybe you think about some small, medium, or large success you hope to have by seeing it as if it's already occurred. Positive thoughts and affirmations are empty and hollow without action. It's not a magic trick, right? I can think about bestsellers and all those things if I want to, but if I never put my fingers on a keyboard, it's not going to happen. But I do know, and again, I can only speak for myself. What I do know is that by shifting my energy, I'm more likely to put my fingers on the keyboard to begin with. Like I said, I'm convinced that this habit has contributed to my success, and that alone means it has.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. You can find out more at teachbetter.com/podcasts. Now let's get back to the episode.
Joining me today for the interview is Rachel Carrillo Fairchild. Rachel is an educator, author, and consultant with nearly 30 years of experience. She has conducted workshops for teachers and administrators on multilingual learners, as well as culturally responsive teaching. She has also presented at national conferences, including ASCD and NCTM. She is the author of How to Reach and Teach English Language Learners and Common Formative Assessments for English Learners. Rachel was also the lead author of Engaged Instruction, Thriving Classrooms in the Age of Common Core, and was a contributing author of Peer Power, Activating an Assessment Revolution. Rachel, that is quite the resume. So welcome to the Tom Schimmer podcast.
Thank you, Tom. It's so great to be here with you today.
Yeah, it's wonderful to have you here as well, and both a great opportunity for us to reconnect and also to explore a topic that I've been wanting to dig into on this podcast for a very long time. And that is the topic, of course, of multilingual learners, or as we often say, English learners, since the language of instruction in North American schools and even international schools tends to be English in those situations. So I want to jump into that topic. But before we dig into our conversation about English language learners, let's start with you, Rachel, and the arc of your career, and maybe talk a little bit about the impact points along that journey that led you to becoming an author, a speaker, an expert, and an advocate for multilingual learners.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that opportunity to share about myself. So, I'm going to start kind of with back in my childhood, because I think just like with our English learners, just like all of us, my family and my background played such a role in where I am today. So I was born and raised in Southern California. My parents, my mom is from a small rural village in Mexico. No electricity, no running water. We would go visit when I was a child, and it just introduced me as a young child to just a completely different world, coming from Southern California and going to this little village and not having lights, having to pull water out of a well. And, it was a completely different life. So Spanish was my primary language. I spoke Spanish at home. And so when I started school, I myself was an English learner, which really has played into that whole idea of advocacy, because I've walked in those shoes. I know what it felt like. And I was an English learner in the 70s before a lot of the strategies and things that we know about today. And so in those days, being an English learner involved, having headphones put on and sitting in the corner and going through a little book while everyone else was at circle time or doing other things. So that experience is so etched into my memory. So one of the things that I think really impacted me is, my parents were both, had limited education. My mom only went to school to the 2nd grade. My dad only went to school to the 6th grade. And so for them, education became kind of the road or the path out of the lifestyle that they had lived and the life that they had lived, where they struggled and they had lived through severe poverty. And I just remember my father from a very young age, just, reminding all three of us, myself and my 2 brothers, you're going to get an education. You're going to go to college. It was an expectation. And he really saw that as the way out of living through the struggles that he and my mom had endured. And so I was the first in my family to graduate from high school. I was the first to attend college, the first to go to college. And so that was a unique experience, kind of navigating that world, being the first to navigate that world, where my parents really couldn't help me or assist me because they hadn't walked that path. So they weren't able to really help me, but they supported me in every possible way that they could. And so I think for that reason, kind of being the first, I stayed close to home. My career, I started teaching and taught for 10 years in the same district in which I went to school. So I got to work with a lot of my own teachers, people who had taught me, my kindergarten teacher, my first grade teacher. And that was fantastic. And then I eventually went to the district office, and I spent 8 years at the district office as a teacher on special assignment. And I got the most amazing opportunity there because I went in as a math teacher on special assignment, and also an expertise in ELD. So the district really wanted to focus on improving our English language development program. And so they thought that I could, kind of wear two hats. It was a smaller, we call it smaller in Southern California district. So we didn't have a lot of support staff at the district office. So they cross-trained us. They had this idea to cross-train us, even though my area of expertise was math. I got to go to early literacy training. I got to attend writing training, struggling readers training, so we all got cross-trained, and that's when I was exposed to the work of Ken O'Connor with grading, and Mike Schmoker and Doug Reeves and Rebecca and Richard DeFore, and it just, it was such an amazing opportunity. I just think of that time period in my career as really kind of, introducing me to research and to assessment and to grading, and really starting for me to ask questions like, how are we assessing our English learners? Are we assessing our English learners, other than just that annual assessment that we have to do once a year that we're required to do? How do we know when our ELs change levels, and are we responding to that? And then I had the great, amazing fortune of going to work for Dr. Douglas Reeves at the Leadership and Learning Center, left my district after 18 years and embarked on this amazing journey that I've been on for the past 12 years. And he really encouraged me to write and to publish, and I did. I never imagined that I would write a book, but I wrote my first one. And then, once I wrote the first one, it was kind of focused on strategies. I started thinking, wait a minute, as teachers, how can we know what strategies to identify or to use if we don't know where our students are in the first place? So don't we have to figure out what the student needs are first, so then that we can be responsive and choose strategies that will work for that student? And so that's what got me thinking about assessment in English learners. And that's where my second book, Common Formative Assessments, I embarked on writing that one because that just seemed like such an area of need. So that's kind of where I started and where I am now.
That is quite, as I said earlier, that is quite the resume, and an incredible story of success, going from being an English learner yourself to sitting in the corner with headphones. And I just can't imagine what that looked like in the 1970s when, again, we didn't know as much as we do now, all the way to now. We sit here in 2021, and you are a published author, an expert, a recognized leader in the area of support for ELs. So an amazing story. Okay, so How to Reach and Teach English Language Learners was published 10 years ago, as you talked about, in 2011. And the first chapter of that book was all about the current state of education for English language learners. So now here we are in 2021, 10 years later. So let's update listeners by doing a couple of things. First, what is the current state of education for ELs? And second, what have we learned over the past 10 years that makes the potential for supporting ELs that much more effective and efficient?
So, just like where we were in 2011, it's been a growing population, right? So we were right around 3 million ELs at that time. We are just about at 5 million English learners nationwide at this point. What's changed a little bit, and that demographic is kind of, in terms of the most common language is Spanish. 78% of our English learners are Spanish speakers, and then the two languages come in second and third, pretty close to each other, are Arabic and Chinese. And then we have a host of other languages, over 400 languages spoken in our classrooms across the country. So, it's a growing population and an evolving population. And I think that what we've learned, I try not to be cynical. A lot of, and I think it's because I see that, 10 years, 11 years later, and your question really does make me kind of pause and think, some things haven't changed. Some things we're still struggling with. The idea of identifying those English learners and then where they go from there. How are we making sure that they're progressing through their language acquisition just as much as they're progressing through their knowledge of content, but how are they progressing in terms of acquiring the English language? And what we've learned about that is, we used to have this figure of 7 to 10 years, and that's really to achieve fluency in a second language. But what we're finding in schools is that to get redesignated or reclassified from an English learner to a fluent English proficient student, in about 2016-15, some research was done, and the finding was at that point, it's about 3.8 years, so about 4 years for students to be redesignated if they come in early, if they're identified in early elementary. Now, we still know, though, that those same challenges, and this is one of those things that it's like, this is the part that hasn't really changed much, is some of our kids don't reclassify in those 4 years. And now they're 6, 7, 8 years into being identified as an English learner. They're in middle school, they're well into high school, have gone through year after year of being told you're not proficient, you're not proficient, you're not proficient. And we end up losing some of those kids who, along the way, decide that maybe their investment hasn't really paid off for them. And they haven't ever developed that sense of efficacy. And so we end up losing them. So that's one of those challenges that I think we still have to face. But at the same time, we've learned a lot. I think we do a much better job of making sure that, just on the SEL front, right? Making sure that we are, providing students with that, a space to honor who they are, where they come from, what they bring, and how they enrich our classrooms. I think that that's something that I feel we do a much better job of now. And so we're learning and we're growing, but still room to grow, and still some areas where our English learners really do need us to step up and, challenge ourselves and do a little bit better.
Yeah. Can you clarify for me something? When you say the original sort of 7 to 10 years, or now the 3.8 years, roughly 4 years, we're talking about academic fluency, are we not? We're not talking about just conversational fluency. We're talking about being able to, those low frequency, high complex words, that's about 4 years for students to develop. Is that a fair distinction to make?
Yes. Okay. So we have, so about 4 years for students to be reclassified. Mm-hmm. And the thing that makes it challenging to talk about that is every district has different reclassification criteria. So we don't have like national, reclassification criteria. So in one district, it might be a combination of grades and state tests and their language proficiency, state language proficiency assessment. In another district, it might be, just grades and the state test. So it's different from district to district.
Yeah.
But what we're talking about there is, yes, within 4 years, students in those earlier, if they come in those earlier grades, kindergarten identified, as an English learner in kindergarten, first grade, they usually will reclassify, the majority of them, in those 3.84 years. But again, not all of them. And those are the kids that we need to worry about, those long-term English learners that I'm sure we're going to talk about.
We definitely are. Yeah. It just makes me think about, the difference between very quickly learning to understand questions or phrases like how much does this cost or where's the restroom versus understanding the concepts of mitosis and meiosis, which are words we don't use very frequently, but they are high complex words. So your point about digging in leads me to the next question, which is, of course, we know that ELs are not a monolith. And often one of my points of frustration is they often get talked about as if they are this singular monolithic group. But I'd like to have you be a little bit specific with different sort of EL profiles. And let's start with those long-term ELs, those who are, again, as we mentioned, conversationally fluent. You could probably have a conversation with them. They've been in your school district for a very long time. English is not spoken at home. They can have a conversation with you for 15 minutes about the weekend, about any sporting events or activities they did, and then they sit down to write the science test and they can't read the questions. So how do we support those students? What are some of the key ideas? And we'll go through different profiles for sure, but let's start with those long-term ELs. How do we support those students?
So long-term ELs, and there's so many different reasons why they could end up a long-term EL. They could be one of those students who had, interrupted education. So they've, left the country, come back. A lot of our long-term ELs are kiddos who are born and raised here in the U.S. Here, definitely, that's been a phenomenon that we're seeing more and more and more. English learners born here. The challenge with that is they don't have a strength in either language. So providing materials for you in Spanish isn't going to help you because you can't read in Spanish, but then you also can't read in English. So you don't really have a dominant language. So with our long-term English learners, I think, coming back to assessment, I think assessment is crucial. It's critical. The one time a year is not going to cut it. So that student that you just described right there, that student who can talk to you about their weekend and has, what we call the BICS, the basic interpersonal communication skills, they've got that down. And if we were to dig into their profile and look at their scores on a language proficiency assessment, what we'd probably find would be something like this. We'd find that in listening and speaking, speaking, they're probably up there, a 4 or a 5, right? So they're definitely on the higher end of language acquisition. But when you would look at their reading and writing, we'd find that those are lower. Sometimes we could have kiddos that are, a 4 or a 5 in listening and speaking, but they're like a 1 or a 2 in reading or writing. So that's why you get this situation where they can talk to you and almost fool us into thinking that they're more proficient than they really are. When we dig into those scores, we find that their reading and writing scores their reading comprehension just isn't there. And so that's where those struggles come in. So the very first thing we have to do is we have to get better at assessing them. We have to get better at finding out where they are, and not just once a year. We have to have some language proficiency checks along the way so that we can be responsive to a lack of progress. So a lack of progress might mean, do we have an issue here where their student might need special education services, right? But that once a year assessment can be devastating, I think, for some of our English learners. If we're only getting one measure a year as to where they are in their language acquisition and we're not able to be responsive, I think that really plays into the reason why this population has grown so much.
Yeah, you are speaking my language when you talk about ongoing assessment and the use of assessment for decisions around instruction, interventions,
Yes.
et cetera. Absolutely.
Yes.
Let's pivot to new ELs. These are students who are new to the country. And they are highly proficient in their native language. So if I were to give them the questions in Mandarin or Arabic or Spanish, they could knock it out of the park, but they don't speak the language of instruction. So what is the strategy? What is the support for those students?
So these are our kiddos where I think one of the most important things we can do for them is just to create a community of inclusion at our schools. And, I was mentioning earlier where we have really gotten a lot better at that. What I would like to see more of is I would love for our teachers to really know their population and know it well enough that that the students are reflected in the classroom. When they walk onto the campus, they see themselves in the faces on the walls, in the books on the shelves, and not just translations of books in English, right? So it's fantastic that we have the true story, the Three Little Pigs, and then we have the translation of it in Spanish, but real authentic literature that is from those cultures of students who are coming to our schools. So I think that's the first thing, is create an environment of inclusion, know that EL population, and then structure opportunities for students to share. In those early days, in those early months and years into our country, these families are facing culture shock. It's a completely different way of living. I described in the introduction, just going from here to Mexico, where I had no electricity, no running water, had to get used to a completely different way of life for just a month, though. And then I got to come home. These children and these families have lived oftentimes in places that didn't have a lot of the same things that we have here. And so they're dealing with culture shock. So how do we structure our schools in a way that we're honoring those funds of knowledge that our English learners bring with them, and that we're providing opportunities for families to share their voice and share about themselves and become part of our community, part of our school community. And I don't think there's anything better we can do than to make those families feel seen and honored, and to feel part of the school community. I've read research and read so much about where they go into schools and they talk to kids, especially English learners, and they ask, do you feel seen? Do you feel like your teachers care about you? And we have kids sitting in classrooms in middle school and high school who answer that question with a resounding no, and that should worry us. If our students don't feel seen, don't feel heard, don't feel as if you were to not show up tomorrow, do you think your teacher would notice? Do you think your teacher would even miss you? And so when we're seeing that's the case sometimes, it really, for me, reinforces the fact that this is a place we can do better, to really make sure that the students know that we see them, we hear them, we honor what they bring to our classrooms. And I think that initially with those new ELs, that's what we need to do. Right. We really need to make sure that they feel part of our community.
That feels very different than 10 years ago in terms of the level of cultural awareness and cultural responsiveness that schools are attending to. I want to pick up on this idea you talked about earlier, that the largest in the United States, the largest segment of ELs is Spanish speaking. Then you said Arabic, and then you said Mandarin. So what if you have students? The question would be, what if we have students for whom their language is a little less common in our community. So obviously there are a number of dual language adults and those who speak Spanish and English. You are an example of that, where if an EL is Spanish speaking, they're probably surrounded by many people who can speak their language. But what if it's a language that is not common in our community? Something beyond, say, Arabic and Mandarin. We go down the list and we say, wow, we don't have anyone living in our small town that speaks that language. What are some of those extra considerations we need for those new ELs for whom their language is unique in that community?
Absolutely. So I think one of the first things that districts have to do is, and especially in these rural small districts, where if you're in an urban setting, you may be more likely to be able to get some resources, to find instructional assistants who speak the language, and to bring them in and have them assist with lessons and teaching and translation. But if you're not in that situation, what do you do? And so I think that one of the first things that districts need to do, and I get this question all the time, what is the best program? What is the best that we can provide for our students? And the answer is, it's the best that you have the resources to provide. So if you don't have the resources and the personnel to be able to have a bilingual program, or to be able to have a dual language program, then let's not attempt it. Because I have been in districts where, because of lack of resources, the kids start in a bilingual kindergarten class with a fantastic bilingual teacher who does a great job with them. Then they go to first grade, and they don't have someone who speaks and can teach first grade. So now they go into a mainstream first grade, and then second grade. Guess what? We've got a bilingual teacher again in second grade. So and so now we've got kids who are bouncing back and forth between a bilingual program and a mainstream program, and a bilingual and mainstream. And so it's no wonder that they end up not being able to reclassify in those 4 years, because by the time they leave that, they don't have a strength in either language. So we have to figure out, what are the resources? What's the personnel we have? If the best we can do is a mainstream program with support in the primary language, where we, can get books from a publisher, then we need to do the best at that, and we need to make sure that that we're absolutely providing the support that we can. But it worries me when I see districts try to take on, develop a program where they don't have the resources or the personnel to really do that program justice, and to really help those students. At the end of the day, they're the ones that are going to, face the consequences of us not having a really cohesive program. So it's, for me, let's do an honest look in the mirror. What do we have at our disposal? What is the best, the absolute best? And when we look at those different programs, absolutely a bilingual dual immersion program, that's at the top. That's the Cadillac, that's what we should all be aiming for. And the mainstream is kind of down here in terms of, it's not the most desirable setting for an English learner. But if this is the best we can do, given the resources that we have, then let's make sure that we do that, but we do it well. And there's ways to do that. There's ways to have an effective mainstream program with primary language support. Because now we have technology, and we have, translation sources online, and videos in different languages. There's just so many more resources now that we could really, schools, even with limited resources and limited language resources, can still do a really good job with a mainstream program.
Yeah. I feel like I know what your answer is going to be to this next one, but I'm going to ask you about special education, because we know that ELs are often overrepresented in special education. And so how do we ensure that we are not mistaking EL for, say, LD, that we're not talking about a learning disability, we're not blending those two, and we're not overrepresenting ELs in special education? How do we do that?
Yeah. So I find that the pendulum swings on that one.
Okay.
It's either they're overrepresented, and we have way too many students that are being identified as special education when it's really a language issue.
Mm-hmm.
And then we get a crackdown on that, and then it swings the other way. And then no one's getting no one's being referred. And then we've got kids falling through the cracks, English learners who truly have a learning disability, but because of the, fear of, I don't want to bring this child to an SST, or when it's not, maybe it's not a learning disability, maybe it's just a language issue. So we have to definitely, and I know you know what I'm going to say, but it comes down to assessment. It comes down to assessment.
I knew it.
How am I going to know? And I think because of a lack of evidence, because of a lack of assessment, because we only have that one mandated language acquisition assessment a year, language proficiency assessment a year, we don't have enough data. And so a lot of times in the absence of data, these decisions are made, and they're not always the right decision. And we're not armed with the information that we need. And so I always say, if that's what we're considering for the placement for a student, we need to make sure that we're doing, our due diligence in terms of assessing that child and finding out what has their progress looked like. Did it stall? Did it in fact stall somewhere? And if it did, is it because it was the language that they stalled, or something happened at home? Did they lose a parent? So lots of considerations, but we have to find a middle ground where we're not overrepresenting and then we're not underrepresenting as well.
Right. Yeah. Listeners are familiar with my take, which is that assessment is the engine that drives so many things, if not everything that we do. And I kind of knew that was going to be your answer, but I wanted to hear you say it, Rachel. and now I want to stick with assessment, but I want to specifically talk, briefly about grading. Because a question I get a lot is, how do I approach grading ELs when it's clear their limited language proficiency is interfering with my ability to accurately assess them on the standards? Is that even fair? Should I even grade some standards, but maybe not grade other standards? I know the answer to that is fairly complex, but if you were to give schools or teachers some general guidelines for grading ELs, especially early on when it's obvious their language proficiency is an issue, what advice do you have for schools or for teachers around grading ELs?
Oh my gosh, this is such a great question. This is a big challenge out there. And I really believe with all my heart that what we should be doing is we should be, especially in those early grades, assessing grading our students based on their language acquisition level. And there's a couple of different ways to do that. I know in my own district, this was something that we had developed. We went to standards-based grading, jumped into the whole standards-based report card. And then this question came up. We've got students who are going, into middle school. And when you look at their report cards, it's F, 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 D, C, F, F, all the way on up. And it's not because it literally was the language that's holding them back. And so they're not at standard yet. And the teachers would say they're making progress, but if that's the standard, and this is where they are, they're not there yet. So I can't really give them an A, just because they're making progress. So what we decided to do, and I think that this is, I've worked with districts on developing a system like this, where they either have a section on the report card where they identify, okay, in reading, this student is at a level 3. Based on level 3 WIDA standards, state language proficiency standards, this student is performing, at a 4, right? If 4 is on the high end of our report card, it's a standards-based report card. They're doing really well on reading level 3 standards, language proficiency standards. But then we also need a true picture of where they are on grade level. Mm-hmm. So then there's the part of the report card that has reading, writing, math, science, social studies. That's where we would put the true reflection of on grade level standards. Now, this student might be performing at a 2 or a 3, but they are making progress on those language acquisition standards. As a parent, that's what I want to know. As a student, that's what I want to know. Right. Because I think about the disservice that we do to our English learners by just telling them over and over and over again, you're not there yet. Right. But they don't know where they are, right? So then where am I? Am I any closer than I was last trimester? Am I further? And so having a report card or a way of a reporting system where we can show growth, where we can show students and their parents that your child is making progress on those language acquisition standards. They may not be on grade level yet, but look at this tremendous progress that they've made. Right. I think that, that's something that schools and districts can explore. And, I think it's an honest way of truly providing that feedback to our students and getting that in their hands.
It really does speak to a comprehensive approach to reporting, which says, yes, we can report on achievement, but we should also be talking about growth and maybe even talking about, my habits of learning, my work ethic, my stick-to-itiveness, my the responsibility, those dispositional aspects. Mm-hmm. That gives us a complete picture of a learner. So as we finish up today, Rachel, I want to talk a little bit about the school or the district level from an organizational or a systems perspective. If there are directors or superintendents who are listening in right now, from your perspective, what are some of the essentials or the non-negotiables that schools and districts need to have in place in order to fully support our ELs and to maximize the efficiency and the effectiveness of their collective outcomes? What do districts and schools kind of need to have in place structurally or systemically?
So I think, and this has been something that I've seen even in the last, past 5 years where I've gone into schools and into districts where they don't have a solid English language development program. They don't have, students aren't being provided with a designated time of day where it's focused on the structures and patterns of the English language, where that's what we're going to be learning. It's without that, and I'll have districts tell me, oh, well, our teachers are doing English language development all day long. It's not always happening. And so when you sit in those classrooms, we can think that and hope that that's happening. But if we don't have a systemic way of implementing English language development district-wide, school-wide, we're really missing the boat on making sure that we're providing that opportunity for our English learners to be successful at learning the language and just the language itself. So I think that's one of the big pieces. I think an assessment system, I've mentioned it already. I think one of the big pieces where we're really missing the boat, and I believe this wholeheartedly. We don't assess English learners enough. We don't assess their language acquisition enough. I even have been working in some schools on having English learners breaking down those language acquisition levels into progressions and having those English learners identify where they are on that progression and setting goals for themselves. If you're a 6th grader, sometimes we get these middle school kids who aren't allowed to pick an elective because they're forced to take, ELD, for example. Right. And they're like, what's ELD? And, we're having to break it to them. Well, you're an English learner. And, they don't even realize that they're English learners. And then it's like, well, what do I do? Like, am I not going to ever get to take an elective? And so how do we bring that ownership to those English learners through a robust assessment system, where teachers have clarity about what English learners need, the progression of the language and what they need to accomplish to get from one level to the other, and where students can see those progressions and use them to self-assess, peer assess, set goals, and really have that true ownership of their learning. I think that's the other piece. If I think as schools and systems did a better job of assessing English learners, I think we could identify long-term English learners before they become long-term English learners. Right. So prevent them from getting there in the first place, and having another label put on them.
I feel like we're going to have you back to maybe a bonus episode to just talk about assessment, because you are speaking my language, and to spend time talking about assessing ELs. This has been just a fascinating conversation, Rachel, and your expertise is clear and obvious. I've got 2 questions left for you. They are the typical questions I use when I finish up the interviews. The first one is educationally speaking, and you could take this in any direction that you'd like. Educationally speaking, what keeps you up at night?
I think one of the things that really does wear on me recently is just this idea of the pandemic has brought to light the inequities in our system. More than ever, we see them just right there. They just smacked us in the face when this pandemic started, and we realized that students of poverty, students like our English learners, special education students, the access, right? Just access to the basics that other students have, and that, we kind of take for granted that all students have. It really does. I think it's a question that we're all, do we have the courage and the resolve to really face that one, and to really, do what has to be done to fix that? I know the last 30 years, I've been bombarded with this, started with with PLCs and, the belief that all students can learn. And I see it in every vision statement and, school, when you walk in, we believe all students can learn. It's not happening. It's not happening. And I think that the pandemic really brought that to light, that we have students who aren't having access, and what are we going to do about it? How are we going to face that challenge? I think that's when we all really should be paying attention to.
I think if there's if there is a silver lining to find as a result of the pandemic, it has forced us to have conversations that were long overdue, and also forced us to look in the mirror and say, do we really follow through on what our mission statements say about these? Is all means all a cliche, or do we actually live that mission in our day-to-day lives, professionally, for sure? Last question for you, Rachel, is this question I've asked everyone I've interviewed so far in the podcast, and it is more of a general question about success and happiness. It's a theme I'm trying to run through the podcast and get everyone's perspective. So I'm interested from your perspective when you think about, so if a random person stopped you on the street and asked you, what's your definition of success? How would you answer them?
I really believe that success is that determination to succeed, even when those around you may not believe that you can succeed. And the reason, one of the things, I was in college and went to one of my professors just to ask, advice. I really wanted to go to grad school, and I'll never forget. She looked, sitting at her desk, looked across at me and said, graduate school isn't for students like you. And
Wow.
that just, that was like one of those moments that if that's not deficit mindset in action, that was like the definition of it. And I just remember that sinking feeling of, why isn't it for students like me? What does she mean by that? Students like
Right.
me? And rather than allow those words to extinguish my desire to learn, it lit a fire in me.
Yeah.
And so I think I've subscribed to the growth mindset even before I knew that there was a label or such a term. But I really do see it as, a person who is determined to succeed no matter what, right? And even if you hear voices of doubt, and even if you hear you can't or you shouldn't, you persist. And you chart that course and stick to it. Even if it means you end up in a different place than you thought you were going to end up. I never envisioned that I would be here today. That wasn't the path that I ever imagined for myself. But I think that's what success is.
There are very few things in life that are more satisfying than proving people wrong. And you most certainly have done that. Listeners, you can and should follow Rachel on Twitter. Her Twitter handle is @RachelELAuthor. It is the same handle on Instagram. You can find Rachel on Instagram as well. You can also find Rachel on Facebook and LinkedIn. Just search her name. You'll find her on Facebook. I'll add links to the show in the show notes for all of those social media accounts, and make sure that people can get in touch with you if they want to reach out and explore this conversation further. As I said earlier, Rachel, this was a very insightful conversation. Your expertise is, like I said, clear and obvious. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure. Thanks.
In Assessment Corner this week, I want to focus on a question about levels. And for some reason, this question has been coming up quite a bit in many of the workshops I've been conducting since, over August and into September. So it's the question about why can't we or why shouldn't we have 0.5s on our scale? Now, to clarify, it's the idea that on a 4-level scale, there would also be a 0.5, a 1.5, a 2.5, and a 3.5, essentially turning 4 levels into 8. Now, sometimes 8 becomes 7 because not every school that I've seen adds the 0.5 before the 1.0. So it could be 7 or 8 levels, but you get the point, right? I've seen both. Okay, so here's the backdrop on the research, and some of you may recall some of the snippets of this from previous episodes, but the bottom line is the research is very clear that fewer, more distinguishable levels is far more reliable than a 0 to 100 scale. That is inarguable. Like in the research, that research literally spans more than 100 years. That is fairly definitive. Even though there's no absolutes in assessment, that's become clear over and over again. Now, of course, when you hear the word reliability in assessment, you should always think about consistency, right? So in the case of grading, it's essentially a question of, given the same evidence or same body of evidence, would 2 or more teachers draw the same conclusion about the quality or the degree to which the student has met the learning goals or the standards? So the research indicates fewer, more distinguishable levels, but it does not pinpoint the number of levels. Now, generally, I would say somewhere between 2 and 5 is doable. Maybe as many as 7 if you want 7 levels to, say, align with the diploma program of IB. But the bottom line, you get to choose as a school or a district how many levels. Okay, so you get to make that choice. The question is not how many levels can you label, because clearly you could have an infinite number of levels if it was only about the labels. The question is, can you describe the difference in quality between the levels? So when asked about the 0.5s, the answer from me is technically, well, yes, you can have 0.5s, you could add them, as long as you can clearly articulate the difference between all 8 levels. And that is where the tension occurs. Because in fairness to the students, they should know the difference between a 0.5 and a 1.0, a 1.5 and a 2.0. And that's where most get stuck. Just try it. Take one of your rubrics and try describing 8 distinct levels of quality. All right, good luck with that. Now, often, not always, But often the desire for the point fives comes as we slip into a kind of normative mindset. It's like, Tom, how do I distinguish between a high 3 and a low 3? And my response to that is, why do you need to? And more importantly, why do you want to do that? What is the obsession with being able to pinpoint out that one student is slightly higher than another student? It's the student against the criteria. That's all that should matter. Oh, but Tom, the universities want it. Listen, let the universities figure it out. This job is challenging enough without you self-inflicting the college admissions process on top of your grading practices. The universities will figure it out. They already do. They know what they're doing. So let them do it. Now, I also hear, Tom, what if they're a little bit in one category and a little bit in another? Now, when I hear that, I'm almost certain that teacher's rubric reads more like a checklist than a description of quality. Like, we have to push ourselves with our colleagues in a collaborative effort. We have to push ourselves to calibrate on criteria so that reliable, again, consistent decisions are made. Increase the number of categories, and you are likely to see more variation in how teachers interpret a body of evidence. So the question is not, can you? The question is, should you? And for me, 8 or even 12 levels is simply going to magnify the inconsistencies with which decisions are made. So when you think about having 4 levels, what we're really talking about here from 4 to 1 is, does the student have a deep or a competent or a partial or a beginner level understanding? If you're using 3 levels, then we would talk about, okay, the student's from 3 to 1. We would say the student has it, they're partway there, they're a beginner. I really don't know why we need more than that. Now, I can tell you from experience that even 5 levels can be tough. I was once working with a world languages department on one of their rubrics. And, they as a school had decided to use a 1 through 7 scale to align with the IB diploma program. So in our conversation working on their rubric, we realized that, kind of the way they used their criteria and the way it played out, it was rare that they ever would use a 1 or a 2. That, 99.9% of the time, the students were a 3 through 7. So we were really only dealing with 5 levels. Listen, I'm not a fan of rubrics that take up real estate or space and describe what students are not. Insufficient evidence is insufficient evidence, and for me, just leave it off the rubric. If it's on the rubric, then it describes an acceptable level of performance. So we set about creating criteria for what I think was conversational fluency, though it's been a few years since that conversation occurred. So we started describing the 3 being a beginner or a novice, a 4 being partway there, a 5 being proficient or competent, a 6 being exemplary, and a 7 being, that's where we got stuck. The labels weren't the issue. The issue was describing each of those levels and distinguishing it from the ones on either side in a way that clearly articulated the criteria. So distinguishing clearly the 6 from the 7 was really challenging for us in this conversation. It started off with a lot of adverbs and adjectives, very excellent or extensively fluent. It was just an exercise in word choice and semantics. So, as our time finished together working on that rubric in that coaching session, they left thinking they might be better served to either try to make some distinction somewhere else on the scale. They were thinking about, partial or partway or developing, either distinguishing between the degree of fluency for binary skills, like grammar, versus the nuances of word choice and sentence structure and creativity, or maybe just going to a 4 through 7 scale, simply just saying, look, you're at the beginning, you're partway there, you're competent, and you have a deep understanding. The point was and is, as soon as you try to authentically describe the differences between these levels, it becomes a lot more challenging. Labeling the levels is not the challenge. The description is the challenge. So while the research doesn't say how many levels, only have as many levels as you need, and more importantly, only have as many levels as you can clearly distinguish between. The PointFives might make us feel more precise, but it's actually the opposite. Okay, that's it for this week. Remember to follow the podcast on Twitter for updates. That's @TomSchimmerPod. You can follow me on Twitter as well. That's at Tom Schimmer. Schimmer Education on Facebook, at Tom Schimmer Podcast on Instagram, and of course, Tom Schimmer Podcast on YouTube. Also, please email your questions for Assessment Corner or any suggestions you have about the podcast to tomschimmerpod@gmail.com. Next week, my guest will be author and speaker Dr. Kathy Vatterott. You might know Kathy as the Homework Lady because of her extensive research on homework. So we're going to focus on that and the larger picture of student stress and anxiety. Please subscribe, rate, review the podcast, of course, especially on Apple Podcasts. And if you like the podcast, please spread the word about the podcast to your friends and colleagues. Have a great week, everyone.